Welcome back to NetTests Plus. I am your host, Jeffrey Way, and today we're going to be talking about JavaScript testing, but specifically we're going to be reviewing a tool called Testem. So Testem is a test runner that, as the description says, makes JavaScript testing fun. Maybe you want to use a tool like Jasmine to test your JavaScript. Well, you probably have to go to their website, you need to download a handful of files, you need to import that into your project, you need to set up all of the paths. All of that can be really time-consuming. But with Testem, that'll do the brunt of the work for us. So with Testem, it's not a specific framework or assertion library. It's not like Jasmine or Mocha. It's the framework that allows you to run any of those. So if I want to use Jasmine, I can. If I want to use Mocha, I can. If I want to use Mocha and a specific assertion library like Chai, I can do that as well. Testem just gives me the means to perform automated testing. It's really very cool, and I want to show you it today. All right, so the first step is we need to, of course, install Testem. So I will have a link to the GitHub page. You'll just scroll down, and there should be an installation link. You're going to need to have Node.js and NPM installed. At this point, I would imagine that you do. But if you don't, go to nodejs.org, and it's essentially a one-click process, and you'll be all set to go. Once you have that all set up, you're going to open up the command line and install Testem, and we're going to pass the G flag to make sure that we install it globally. So once that is done, we need some project to work with. So I'm going to cd into my desktop, and I will make a directory called tutorial, and I'll cd into that. And now I'm going to run our new command, Testem. So what's going to happen here is it says, okay, open up this URL to connect. So I will copy that, and now I run the URL, and we do see, all right, it seems to be working. And I return to the command line, and now it's automatically going to refresh anytime you have a new file, or you save it, or you add a new spec. So here we can see, of course, there were no tests to run, so we don't get anything at all. Let's fix that. Let's add a test. Here I've opened up that new directory, and we'll create our first test file. Maybe we're writing tests for some kind of quiz engine. So I will call it quiztest.js. And now by default, Testem is set up to work with Jasmine. But if you want to switch over to Mocha or something like that, it's really a one-word change, and then you're using Mocha. So let's do our first describe block. I'll set the syntax to Jasmine, and we're going to describe a quiz. So the first thing I can think is, if I'm thinking of a quiz as a model, then a quiz should maybe have a default score of 0. And then every time you answer a question, your score goes up. So my first thinking is a quiz should have a default score of 0. So let's add that. It should have a default score of 0. All right, so how can we run this? Well, why don't we say var quiz equals a new quiz. And now I'm going to expect that quiz.score. I'm going to expect that to be 0. All right, so now I've saved this file. Let's bring back the command line, and now you'll notice I didn't have to rerun everything. Testem is monitoring this for us. So it immediately sees a reference error, quiz is not defined. All right, well, let's fix that. Let's create our quiz.js file. We're not really using any kind of framework here. We're not using Backbone. So we'll say var quiz equals function. Now in this case, we're really just working with pseudocode. So most likely you'd have some kind of name spacing. So you'd have app.quiz. But we're not going to do this in this case. So just bear with me, and we'll just make it a global variable for the time being. So now we've created the quiz. Let's go back, and you'll notice that it says quiz is not defined. Of course it's not, because it should be capital Q. So now we come back and notice that Testem has already picked up that new file. It's imported it before our test file. So now it knows, okay, well, I do have a quiz, but I expected undefined to be 0. Well, let's fix that. This.score equals 0. I run it again, and now we get one test complete. So you have your option. You can work in the command line like this, or if you prefer the browser, you'll see that you get the nice pretty view when working in the browser. And that will auto-update as well. So I could put these side by side, and let's do another assertion. How about a quiz must have a title? All right, well, it should have a title. And now, once again, var quiz equals new quiz. We're going to expect that quiz.title. I just want to make sure that that has been defined. So make sure it's not a falsy value. And now we can see that, yes, this did fail, and I didn't have to refresh anything. Testem is doing that for me. So we will fix that, of course. We'll say this.title equals And for now, why don't we make it equal to an empty string? But notice that that is making the spec passed. And that's because, yes, title is defined, so we are passing this. But what I should probably do is, I need the title to be essentially a truthy value. I don't want it to be an empty string or false or null. So why don't we change this to be truthy? And now that's back to failing. So then at this point, maybe we can pass that in, like so, or maybe you pass in a configuration object or something like that. But let's keep it like that, and then we can be sure that we need to pass in a title. My first quiz, and now it's passing. So let's stop it right there. That's been great. Testem is working perfect for us, but let's say we need a little bit more structure. So now we're going to place our tests within a test directory. So let's create a new test folder, and we're going to move our test file into the test folder. Great, so now we have our quiz.js, and we also have quiz test. But now if I come back, it looks like it's not working anymore. I can close this out by pressing Control-C and running it again. But yeah, no tests were run. And that's because by default, Testem is just going to look in the root. If you need to be more specific, and you probably will if you're using a framework or something like that, then we need to provide a little bit of configuration for Testem. So to do that, we would create a Testem, and you have your choice of creating a YAML file, or if you prefer JSON like I do, you could create a JSON file. So in this case, we need to give it some settings. So first, framework. Now the default, as I noted, would be Jasmine. So this is not necessary, but if you did want to do something like Mocha, you would have to be explicit about that. I'm going to comment that out for the time being, and let's first set up the source files. So I'm going to run source files, and make this equal to an array. So this will be the files that we are going to load. So let me give you an example. We will load tests, and I will simply grab all of the files within that test directory. So now pay attention. If I reload the page, it looks like we have a problem. If this ever happens, go back to your command line and check it out. And here we can see, looks like it's having some problems with that. Let's get rid of that entirely. All right, one more time. Let's bring up Testem. And now it's back and running. I'll reload the page. And now notice that everything is failing, but if I view the source, this is what's most important. The source files specifies the files that Testem is going to bring in. So in this case, it brings in the Testem files. You don't have to worry about that. But also, because I specified that I wanted to bring in every file within the test folder, it went ahead and did that for me. But now notice that we only brought in the test. We also need to, of course, bring in our actual files. So I will bring in, and in this case, why don't we just do star.js. If I reload the page, now you'll see that it does bring in any files within the root of my project that end in .js. So now if I come back and I reload the page, everything is back to normal. And this way we can actually organize our projects a bit more. So we will create a scripts file, and we will move script.js into the scripts folder, close all of this out, and now one more time it's failing, so we need to specify the path to where our actual scripts are. And now that's working. Now while I'm here, there's one other thing I want to show you. Let's close out our test runner entirely, bring back the command line, close this out, and try to run it again. What you're going to see is it says open the URL below. But wouldn't it be nice if this would just automatically be done for us? And we can do that within our config file. So at the top, I will say launch in dev, and we can specify here which browser, or more than one browser that we want to launch. I'll say Chrome in this case. We need to pass an array, and we'll say Chrome. All right, that should do it. Let's try it again. Testem, and now this time it automatically launches the browser for you, and then if you want, you can just hide that in the background and continue working. Now, what if we instead don't want to use Jasmine? We want to use Mocha, which is my preference these days, but it's very similar to Jasmine. They're both excellent. Anyhow, let's set framework now. We're going to be working with Mocha. Well, now that I make that change, we can see that we're having a problem. Expect is not defined. And that's because Mocha allows us to use any assertion library that we want. You can use expect, you can use should, or you can use chai, which is my preference. So let's go ahead and get that set up. That one we will need to download. If I browse to chai.js.com, we can download this for the browser, and we'll just download it right here. And why don't I just copy it and bring it back, and we're going to store this within our tests folder. and paste it in. Great. So now I can close this out. We do have chai, so let's make this full screen once more. And now we need to import that. So remember here with our testem.json file, our source files, we're looking into the scripts folder and we're looking into the test folder. So let's see if that works. Let's run it again and view this in the browser. And now you can see we're working with Mocha. We view the source. It is pulling in Testem, the mocha.js file. It's then pulling in our quiz, chai, and our test. So now let's see why it's failing. Well, it's still saying expect is not defined. And that's because we just need to set that up in our file. So at the top here, why don't we say, and I'll switch over to Jasmine just because the syntax is the same. We'll say var expect equals chai.expect. And that should do it. Now, we're still going to have to make some syntax changes, but if we come back, now we can see, all right, it does recognize expect, but now it has no idea what this method to-be is. And that's because it's for Jasmine. In Mocha, we would do something like this. Expect quiz.score to equal 0. And let's do the same thing down here. We'll say to.be okay. Okay is just how we can assert that something should be truthy. All right, so let's go back and try this. Back in the browser, and now we have successfully switched over to Mocha, and it really didn't require much effort at all. We just had to download our assertion library that we want to use, and we have to update the syntax, and that's normal. That has nothing to do with Testem at all. Now, what if instead of expect, we want to use the should.js assertion? Well, why don't we change this now? We'll say var should equals chai.should. Notice that with should, you're actually going to call a method, and with expect, you're not. So that's one thing that can trip you up at first. But now instead of doing the expect style, with should, you would say quiz.score.should equal 0. And we'll change this one as well, quiz.title.should.be okay. So you can see with Mocha and Chai, the difference with Jasmine is that there's a much bigger focus on readability. And whether or not you like this really just comes down to your taste. Some people think that this is verbose, where it's literally should.be.okay, but I happen to like it. The more readable my tests are, the easier it is to come back to 6 months down the line, or the easier it is for somebody else on my team to review this. If we go back to the browser, that's still working. Go into the command line. Yep, we have 2 tests. So to finish up, what about Coffeescript? Now that's something a lot of people like to do as well. Can we do Coffeescript testing in Testem as well? And yes, the way it works is Testem gives us the ability to execute commands before or after the tests are run. So this gives us the perfect time to compile our Coffeescript. Let me give you an example. Let's rename this to quiztest.coffee. I'm going to delete everything so we can start from scratch. We'll begin by saying should equals chai.should, and now we will describe a quiz. And once again, it should have a default score of 0. And we'll say new quiz.score.should be 0. So now we've written some Coffeescript. So how can we tell Testem that we are working with Coffeescript and we need to compile this? Well, we of course go back to our configuration file. The first thing we're going to do is adjust source files. The source files will be what is going in. What does Testem need to be monitoring? Or if it's easier, just think about it. What does Testem need to monitor for changes? And that's what source files would be. So we'll say we're going to look in tests, look for everything that ends in .coffee. So if there's any other file in your project that you want Testem to monitor for changes, you would add that here as well. But we obviously don't want to serve coffee files, and that's what this would do. So if I were to come back to Chrome and I view the source, notice that because we set that there, now Testem's trying to add a .coffee file. And of course, that's not what we want to do. So that's where this next option comes in, serve files. We're going to serve test/star.js. Now if I come back and reload, notice that it is bringing in chai.js, and it would bring in any other file within the test directory. So we're getting there, but now we need to be able to tell Testem that we want to compile coffee. So maybe you're already doing this on the side. Maybe you use CodeKit by Brian Jones. Maybe you just have Coffeescript running in the command line, where it's just watching the files and automatically compiling. There's lots of ways, but if you want Testem to do this for you, once again within your configuration file, we can do that. This next option is called before tests. Is there a command that we want to run before our tests are executed? And yes, there is. what we want Coffee to do, and by the way, this assumes that you do have Coffeescript installed. Once again, you can install it through npm. But what we want to do is have Coffeescript compile all Coffee files. So how could you do that? Well, you could say coffee-c, and if you just wanted to compile everything in all directories, just hit period. All right, it's sort of like git add period. It's going to compile all Coffeescript files. So this is good if your script files will also be Coffeescript. In our case though, we're just going to compile everything within the test folder that ends in .coffee. All right, so now when I save it, notice that it immediately compiled quiz.test. And what's most important though is we want to make sure that every time I save the Coffeescript file, it recompiles again. So let's change this and say should.be 5. If I go to quiz test, notice that it was updated there as well. And again, that is because of source files. That is what Testem is monitoring. So to recap, Testem is monitoring our Coffeescript files. Before you run the test, it is compiling them down. And then ultimately, the files that it is serving to the browser are the test/star.js. Now if I reload, notice it brings in chai, it brings in test, and we also need to bring in scripts star.js as well. Reload the page, and now we have everything going. That's failing, so let's go back, and yep, I even made that mistake myself. Should is actually a method call. And now we come back and we're saying should have a default score of 0, property B is not a function. Let's come back, and yep, we've switched over to Mocha, so that should be should.equal 0. All right, and now it's passing, great. So if we want to do one last test together using Mocha and chai, we have the score, the title. Maybe the quiz should also have a means to increment the score. So let's see, it should correctly increment correct questions. How about that? When you get a question right, the score should increment correctly. How would you write that? Well, let's try this out. How about we'll say quiz equals a new quiz, and now I will run quiz.increment. But already I'm thinking that in order for the score to be incremented correctly, the quiz needs to have some way to detect the total number of questions for our quiz. So with that in mind, why don't we temporarily comment this and add another one? We'll say it should store the total num of questions. And now once again, new quiz.num questions should be above 0. So we're essentially saying the number of questions should be greater than 0. And let's go ahead and get rid of this temporarily. All right, let's open up the command line and run the test. So we get cannot read property should. If you ever get this, that's because num questions is returning undefined, so should cannot be stacked on undefined. So let's fix that. Quiz.js, and we'll say this.num questions equals, and why don't we change this to config num questions and config.title, and then this will accept a config object. All right, that looks good to me. So let's close that out. And now let's do a before each here. So we'll say before each, we'll say quiz equals a new instance of quiz. And now we're going to pass in the num questions should be 10 in this case. Great. So now we can change all of this. Instead of creating a new instance each time, we can reference the new instance that we create before each spec. Like that. All right, let's see if that looks okay. And now we get 2 tests complete. And if you want, one thing that Testem allows you to do is log. So you could say console.log quiz.numQuestions, and now you'll see that it will display the output. So now we have 10. Great. Now that we have that test written, we can check out the increments. So it should correctly increment the score when a question is correct or right. So how would we do that? Well, we'll say quiz.increment, and now I should expect that the score should be 10. There's a total of 10 questions, so a total score of 100 divided by 10 is 10 points. So for every question you get right, you get 10 points added on. So now I'm going to say quiz.score should equal 10. I think that should do it. So now we get object has no method increment. Of course it doesn't because we haven't created it yet. So let's do that now. Quiz.prototype.increment. By the way, if you were doing this in Coffeescript, you could just create a class. It's really nice. But in this case, we have to do it the manual way. Anyway, so we create our new increment method. Now we get expected 0 to equal 10. So when we call this method, we need to update the score. So how can we figure this out? Well, we know that the amount to increment would be the total points available, 100, divided by this.num questions. So if the number of questions is 10, 100 divided by 10 is 10. So we can then just say this.score plus equals 100 divided by this.num questions. And I think that should do it. So how do I test it? Well, I just look at my tests and now I can see, yep, I did it right, because now all the tests are passing, so it must have been right. Now, if you just want the peace of mind, well, you could go back to your test and you could do more than one assertion here if you need to. So you could say let's overwrite the number of questions and say, now there's only 2 questions. Then I will say quiz.score. Let's bring that down to 0 so we can start from scratch, or you could create a new spec, but I'm going to keep it here. Then when I call quiz.increment, I'm going to expect that quiz.score should be or equal 50, because now there's 2 questions. 100 points divided by 2 is 50 points for each question. So when you get one right, the increment method is called, and now we need to ensure that the score should be equal to 50. We run the tests, and yeah, it's still passing, but if we were to change that to 40, now we get this immediate feedback, nope, your tests failed. So you'd know that you need to make some changes. All right, so that's pretty much what I wanted to show you. The only other thing is, notice that we compile our Coffeescript. If I quit by hitting Q, notice that the JavaScript file is still there. If you want, you can tell Testem to get rid of that entirely. So I could say on exit, and then once again, this is just a bash script right here. So I'll say remove everything within the test folder that ends with *test.js. So what this means is when we close out Testem, we're done testing for the day, we're going to go into the test folder and delete or remove any file that ends in test.js. All right, let's try it again. Testem, everything's working. It opens up Chrome. Now I hit Q to close out. And now notice that it did correctly delete the compiled files. And that's a good way to work, I think. And that does it for the day. So if you have any questions at all, just leave a comment below this article and I'd be glad to help. As always, if you want to stay up to date on new tutorials and screencasts, you can follow us through our RSS feed. You can come say hi at Twitter in Vado WebDev, or you can come by on Facebook and say hello. All right, my name's Jeffrey Way. See you later.